Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku made a deal with the devil to gain ultimate power? Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The air was thick with the taste of ozone and pulverized concrete. It was a flavor Izuku Midoriya had grown to associate with failure. Rain, cold and relentless, fell in sheets, plastering his tattered green costume to his skin and mingling with the blood that oozed from a dozen different wounds. It turned the gray dust of the ruins into a thick, clinging mud that felt like a shroud. His body was a symphony of agony. His right arm, a latticework of shattered bones held together by raw will and the crackling green lightning of One for All, screamed with every twitch. His legs felt like overstrained pistons, ready to seize. He had been holding his power at its absolute zenith, a roaring 100% augmented by the combined wills of the vestiges, for nearly 20 minutes. It was a feat that should have leveled a city block. Instead, it had only made things worse. The villain called himself Kismet. A man in a simple, gray suit, with eyes that held the placid indifference of a storm cloud. His quirk was not one of flashy destruction, or overwhelming force. It was far more insidious. He called it the zone of consequence. Within a 5-block radius of his person, the laws of causality were twisted into a cruel parody. Every action bred a disproportionate and terrible reaction. It was Newton's third law filtered through a sadist's imagination. When Endeavor had first arrived and unleashed a prominence burn, Kismet hadn't even flinched. The jet of cleansing fire had dissipated harmlessly a few feet from him, while 3 blocks away, a water main erupted with the force of a geyser, flooding an underground shelter. When Bakugo, with a snarl of frustrated rage, fired a pinpoint AP shot, the focused blast unraveled, and the kinetic energy was transferred, causing a nearby crane to buckle and drop its multi-ton load onto a line of evacuated cars. Heroism itself was the enemy's fuel. The desire to save was the very thing creating the disaster. You see, heroes? Kismet's voice had been a calm, lecturing drone throughout the chaos, broadcast from every speaker in his zone. Car stereos, security systems, abandoned cell phones. Your very presence is a catalyst for suffering. Your justice is a variable I can manipulate. Every life you try to save, you are simply gambling with another. The only winning move is not to play. Class 1A had tried to play differently. Ida's Recipro burst to evacuate a cornered family had caused the street behind him to liquefy into sinking asphalt. Uraraka's attempt to make a falling chunk of debris weightless had tripled the gravity in the apartment below it, pancaking the entire floor. They had been forced to stop, to stand by as helpless spectators in their own tragedy, the weight of their inaction just as heavy as the consequences of their actions. That left Deku. One for All was different. A power stockpiled, passed down. It seemed to have a will of its own, and for a few precious minutes, it felt like he could fight the zone's influence. He wasn't creating new actions. He was releasing stored energy. A 45% Delaware smash had actually connected, sending Kismet skidding back. But the consequence had been a subway tunnel collapsing beneath them. He had learned the hard way. The bigger his action, the more devastating the reaction, which led to now. Kismet stood at the epicenter of the destruction, a mocking smile on his face. And before Deku, the impossible choice had finally presented itself. The culmination of the villain's cruel thesis. To his left, a school bus, commandeered for evacuation, teetered on the fractured edge of an overpass. The metal groaned in protest, its back wheels spinning uselessly over a 50-foot drop. Inside, the terrified, screaming faces of 30 children were pressed against the windows, their cries barely audible over the storm and the sirens. To his right, Muzurifu General Hospital. A support pillar on its western wing, damaged in the initial chaos, was now groaning under a stress that defied physics. Red emergency lights strobed from within, casting bloody shadows against the windows. It was packed with patients from the initial disaster, a vertical city of the wounded and helpless. And Deku knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that Recovery Girl's primary triage center was in that wing. Her young protege, a bright-eyed intern named Hannah, had personally updated him on their status just an hour ago. Choose, Deku, Kismet's voice echoed, soft and intimate, as if he were whispering right in his ear. The symbol of the future, or the caregivers of the present. Apply your power to one, and the other will pay the price. Such is the nature of consequence. One for all flared, green lightning arcing violently around him. The vestiges were a screaming chorus in his mind, a storm of indecision and fury. Save the children, bellowed a voice he recognized as Nana Shimura's. The infrastructure, the doctors, they can save more in the long run, argued the cold, pragmatic second user. Deku's mind, usually a whirlwind of tactical analysis, was a dead, silent void. There was no third option. No clever plan. No plus-ultra solution. There was only A or B, loss or a different, more terrible loss. He looked at the bus, at the small hand pressed against the glass, a child no older than Eri. Then he looked at the hospital, a beacon of hope now turned into a tomb in waiting. His heart, the heroic heart that All Might had nurtured, fractured. It was a choice no one should ever have to make. He made it. Float, he roared, the word tearing from his throat, raw and desperate. He couldn't risk a smash. He couldn't risk any kinetic force. He channeled the raw, untamed power of the sixth user's quirk through the conduit of his own will. Black whip, thick as bridge cables, erupted from his back and arms, not to attack, but to anchor. They shot past the bus, embedding themselves deep into the bedrock of the buildings across the chasm. He became the living counterweight. With a surge of 100% power that felt like it was tearing his soul from his body, he pulled. The muscles in his back and shoulders shredded. The bones in his arms, already broken, ground against each other. But the bus, with an agonizing screech of tortured metal, began to slide forward, away from the precipice and onto the solid ground of the overpass. The children's screams turned from terror to relief. He had saved them, and in the exact same instant, a deafening crack echoed from his right. It was not the sound of thunder. It was the sound of a world breaking. He turned his head, his vision blurring from the strain, just in time to see the western wing of Muzurifu General Hospital surrender to Kismet's cruel physics. It didn't explode. It didn't crumble in a cloud of dust. It folded. The support pillar gave way with a final, mournful groan, and 10 stories of steel, concrete, and human life pancaked downwards, floor by floor, in a slow, deliberate, and utterly unstoppable cascade. The sound was a drawn-out, grinding roar, a noise that would be permanently etched into the memory of everyone who heard it. The lights in the wing went out, one floor at a time, like a dying titan closing its eyes. Then silence. A silence more profound and terrifying than any explosion. It was the silence of hundreds of voices extinguished in a single moment. Kismet sighed, a sound of theatrical disappointment. A predictable choice. The emotional versus the logical. You heroes are all the same. He then simply turned and walked away, his zone of consequence shrinking with him. The other heroes, finally freed from its influence, were too stunned to give chase. The disaster was already complete. Deku's strength vanished. The black whip tendrils dissolved into nothing, and he collapsed onto the wet asphalt, his body a dead weight. The rain washed the grime from his face, revealing cheeks already wet with tears. He hadn't just failed. He had been an active participant in the massacre. His choice, his heroic act of saving the bus, had been the trigger that executed the people in that hospital. He lay there for an eternity, the world a muted cacophony of approaching sirens and panicked shouts. He could feel gentle hands on him, hear Uraraka's frantic, tear-choked voice calling his name, but it all felt like it was happening a universe away. Someone, he vaguely registered it was Cementas, was already trying to work on the mountain of rubble that was once the hospital wing. But it was a hopeless gesture. There was no sound. No calls for help. Just the tomb-like silence of compressed ruin. Later, after being forcibly carted away and patched up, he returned. The rain had softened to a miserable drizzle. The site was cordoned off, a frantic, floodlit hub of activity. Rescue workers in bright orange gear moved with a grim, practiced efficiency, but their faces were masks of despair. They weren't rescuing. They were recovering. All Might found him standing at the edge of the police tape, a borrowed blanket draped over his shoulders doing nothing to stop the shaking that racked his body. The hero's skeletal form seemed even more frail and unsubstantial in the harsh glare of the emergency lights. He placed a bony hand on Izuku's shoulder. Young Midoriya, he began, his voice raspy with grief. You did what you could. You made a choice. In our line of work, he faltered, the old words, the ones he had used to comfort himself for decades, catching in his throat. Don't, Izuku whispered, his voice broken. Please don't. But All Might pressed on, because it was all he knew. You can't save everyone, my boy. It is the hardest, most painful lesson a hero must learn. But you saved those children. You have to hold on to that. The words, meant to be a bomb, were acid. They weren't a comfort, they were an indictment. An acceptance of a fundamentally flawed premise. You can't save everyone, the phrase echoed in the hollow space where Izuku's spirit used to be. Why not? Why was that the rule? Why build a society around heroes if their core function was inherently, tragically, limited? What was the point of One for All, of this immense, world-breaking power, if it still forced him to stand at a crossroads and choose who lives and who dies? He looked at the rubble, a monstrous gravestone for his ideals. He imagined Hannah's bright smile, the way she'd enthusiastically explained a new splinting technique to him last week. He imagined the hundreds of others. Mothers, fathers, sons, daughters. All gone. Not because of a villain's direct attack, but as a consequence of him being a hero. The very concept felt like a cosmic joke, and he was the punchline. It's not enough, Izuku said, the words barely audible over the hum of the generators. It's not acceptable. To have this much power, and to still be helpless. He looked at his hands, the scarred, broken things that had failed so spectacularly. My power, this path, it's flawed. It's not enough to save people. It just chooses different victims. All Might had no answer. He could only stand there, a relic of a simpler age, as his successor's heart audibly shattered. Izuku turned and walked away, stumbling into the darkness beyond the floodlights. He found himself in a deserted, debris-strewn park a few blocks from the disaster. He fell to his knees in the mud, the blankets sliding from his shoulders. The rain began to fall harder again, a cold, uncaring torrent. He was alone. Utterly and completely alone in a way he had never been before. Not when he was a quirkless child, not when he was facing down villains. This was a deeper solitude, the isolation of total, soul-crushing failure. He clenched his fists, digging his nails into his palms until they bled. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the image of the hospital wing collapsing was burned onto the inside of his eyelids. The sound of it was the only thing he could hear. Help me, he thought, a silent, desperate prayer to no one. Please. I can't do this. I can't let this happen again. I would give anything. Anything at all. He lowered his head until his forehead touched the cold, wet earth, and a single, guttural sob escaped his lips, a sound of pure, undiluted agony. It was the sound of a boy's dream dying, and in that perfect moment of absolute despair, when his hope was a void and his spirit was an open wound, a new voice entered his mind. It was not the frantic chorus of the vestiges. It was not his own self-deprecating thoughts. It was smooth, calm, impossibly clear, cutting through the storm inside his head like a surgeon's scalpel. It didn't come from outside, but bloomed from the deepest, darkest corner of his own consciousness. There is a way. Izuku's breath hitched. He lifted his head, looking around the empty park, his eyes wide with confusion. The voice continued, patient and serene, a stark contrast to the hurricane of his emotions. A way to ensure this never happens again. A way to be strong enough. A way to defy the cruel math of consequence and loss. A flicker of something he hadn't felt in hours, a dangerous, desperate spark of hope, ignited in the pit of his stomach. Who's there? He whispered to the rain. The voice chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It was inside him, around him, everywhere. It was the sound of an answer to an impossible question. There is a way, Izuku Midoriya. A way to save them all. The rain did not stop. It simply ceased to exist. One moment, Izuku was on his knees in the cold, clinging mud of the park, the world a symphony of sorrowful water. The next, there was silence. A profound, bottomless quiet that swallowed the sound of the storm, the distant sirens, and even the frantic, ragged beat of his own heart. The feeling of wet earth beneath his forehead vanished, replaced by something smooth, cold, and unnervingly sterile. The agony that had been a constant companion in his muscles and bones for hours evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, weightless calm. He lifted his head, blinking. He was no longer in the park. He stood in a place of frozen horror. A snapshot of his greatest failure, rendered in shades of gray and despair. Before him, the western wing of Unauthorized General Hospital was caught in an eternal, silent state of collapse. Each floor was suspended fractions of an inch above the one below it, a deck of cards mid-shuffle. Chunks of concrete and twisted rebar hung in the air like macabre mobiles, their motion arrested forever. To his left, the school bus teetered on the edge of the broken overpass, the children inside not screaming, but staring forward with the blank, porcelain expressions of dolls. There was no sound. No wind. No smell of dust or rain. The sky above was a uniform, leaden slate, offering no light of its own, yet the scene was illuminated with a stark, shadowless clarity. He looked down. The ground beneath his feet was not concrete or mud, but a flawless expanse of black glass that reflected the gray sky, making it feel as if he were standing on the precipice of an endless void. This was his mind. His soul. A mausoleum built to house a single, unforgivable moment. A grim choice of decor, the voice said. It was the same one from the park, smooth, calm, and resonant. But honest, I suppose? Izuku spun around. Standing 10 feet away, perfectly poised on the glass surface, was himself. Or rather, a version of himself he could only dream of being. This Izuku was taller, or at least he held himself with an effortless posture that gave that impression. His wild green hair was perfectly coiffed. The freckles on his cheeks seemed less like a boyish spray and more like a carefully placed constellation. He wore no hero costume, but a simple, impeccably tailored black suit, the kind seen on CEOs and world leaders, with a dark green tie knotted perfectly at his throat. There were no scars on his hands. His eyes, the same shade of emerald green, held no trace of the frantic anxiety that had defined Izuku his entire life. They were calm, analytical, and ancient. "Who are you?" Izuku asked, his voice a raw, trembling whisper in the vast silence. The figure in the suit smiled, a small, knowing expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You could call me a great many things. A facilitator. A primordial force. A necessary consequence of desire. But for our purposes, you may call me the broker." He took a slow, deliberate step forward, the sound of his leather shoes a sharp, solitary crack in the stillness. "I am the answer to the question you screamed into the mud a few moments ago." Izuku flinched, the memory of his raw, desperate plea feeling like a fresh wound. The voice, "That was you." "Indeed," the broker said, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "You reached a point of absolute negation. You found the limits of your power, the flaws in your philosophy, and they broke you. Despair like that creates a resonance, a frequency I am uniquely attuned to. You called, Izuku Midoriya, and I have answered." 100 lessons from his UA ethics classes screamed warnings in his head. Deals with strange entities, offers of power in moments of weakness. It was the textbook definition of a villain's origin story. He clenched his fists, the phantom memory of his injuries returning. "I don't want anything from you." The broker raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Don't you? You just knelt in the rain and wished for the power to prevent this." He gestured languidly at the frozen disaster around them. "You wished for a world where you didn't have to choose between the bus and the hospital. A world where you could simply save everyone. That is what you want, is it not? The absolute, unconditional power to impose your heroic will upon a chaotic world?" Every word was a perfectly aimed arrow striking the very core of his being. It was exactly what he wanted. The shame of it burned in his gut. Power like that, it isn't real. It's not possible. "Oh, it is very possible," the broker countered, his voice dropping, becoming more intimate, more persuasive. "The universe you inhabit is a story, Izuku. A chaotic, poorly written one, filled with random tragedies, unjust consequences, and contradictions. Quirks are simply uncontrolled, unpredictable edits to the manuscript, scribbled in the margins by a madman. Heroes like you? You're just frantic editors, running around with erasers and whiteout, trying to fix typos with brute force. You see a building collapsing and you try to hold it up. You see a person falling and you try to catch them. You are reacting. Always reacting. He took another step closer, his placid green eyes boring into Izuku's. I am offering you something more. I am offering you the author's pen. The metaphor hung in the silent air, beautiful and terrifying. Izuku's mind reeled, trying to grasp the sheer scale of the concept. Imagine it, the broker whispered, his voice a siren's song. When Kismet's quirk began to weaken that hospital pillar, you wouldn't have had to choose. You could have simply looked at it, and willed it to be stronger. You could have decreed that its structural integrity was absolute. The zone of consequence would have had nothing to leverage. You could have looked at the teetering bus and authored its brakes to hold, its tires to regain their grip. You wouldn't be fighting reality. You would be rewriting it to match your vision of salvation. Izuku stared at the frozen tableau, his imagination painting the scene as the broker described it. A world where his will was law. No more collateral damage. No more impossible choices. No more failure. Just perfect, flawless victory. The sheer, intoxicating allure of it was so strong it made him dizzy, but he was All Might's successor. He was a hero. He knew, with every fiber of his being, that there was a catch. What's the price? He asked, his voice steadier now, laced with suspicion. My soul? The broker actually laughed, a short, dry chuckle of amusement. Souls? How wonderfully archaic. No, Izuku, I am not some crude demon from your religious myths. I don't deal in such bulky, ill-defined commodities. The concept is meaningless. He gestured to himself, to the sharp suit and the calm demeanor. I am a businessman. A connoisseur. My price is far more refined, more personal. He paused, letting the silence stretch, forcing Izuku to lean into his next words. I trade in the currency of meaning, the broker stated. Emotion. Connection. The very fire that makes you who you are. The fuel of your heroism. Izuku frowned, not understanding. What does that mean? It means this, the broker said, his voice losing its persuasive warmth and taking on the cold, hard edge of a contract's fine print. The power I offer, this authorial control, is a form of miracle, and every miracle requires a sacrifice. For every significant act of salvation you perform, for every life you save by rewriting the story, I will take a payment. I will claim a memory. A cold dread, far deeper and more chilling than the rain had been, seeped into Izuku's bones. You'll erase my memories? Not erase. That would be messy, the broker corrected him patiently. I will consume the emotional weight attached to it. You will retain the factual data. You would, for instance, know that you attended UA high school. But the pride you felt walking through its gates for the first time? The nervous excitement of the entrance exam? The camaraderie you felt with your classmates? That will be mine. You will know that your mother's name is Inko Midoriya and that she raised you, but the feeling of her hand on your cheek, the warmth of her hugs, the unconditional love that buoyed you through your darkest days? That will be my fee. He let the horror of the proposition sink in. You will save them, the broker said, his voice soft again. But you will slowly, piece by piece, forget why it mattered so much to you in the first place. You will become the perfect, efficient hero you dream of being. Unburdened by sentiment, untroubled by emotional connections. Purely logical. Purely effective. Izuku recoiled as if struck. He stumbled back on the glass floor, shaking his head. No. No, that's everything. My memories, my feelings, that's who I am. Without that, I'm just a machine. A machine that saves everyone, the broker finished for him, his expression unreadable. Isn't that the goal? An acceptable loss, wouldn't you say? Your personal sentiment traded for the lives of thousands, perhaps millions. The argument was a twisted, perfect trap. He was using Izuku's own heroic calculus against him. Was his own inner world, his love and his pain, worth more than a single life he could save? Worth more than the hundreds who died in the hospital? The question was obscene, a violation of everything he believed in. I can't, Izuku choked out, tears welling in his eyes. I won't you? The broker asked, and the world around them shifted. The frozen tableau of the hospital collapse dissolved, replaced by a new, horrifying vision. They were standing in the ruins of a city, Jaka City, he recognized with a jolt. Tamura Shigaraki stood at its center, more monster than man, his body a grotesque canvas of quirks. His hand touched the ground, and a wave of gray decay spread out, silent and absolute. Buildings, streets, people, they all turned to dust in an instant. Izuku saw his friends, his teachers, fighting desperately, only to be caught in the wave, their faces masks of terror, as they disintegrated. You could stop this, the broker's voice narrated calmly from beside him. Not by fighting him, but by simply writing him out of the story. You could will his quirk factor to be null. A single thought, and he becomes a harmless man. The vision shifted again. He was in a brightly lit room. Eri, older now, was screaming. Her horn was glowing with a terrifying intensity, the golden light spiraling out of control. A crowd of people around her were caught in the wave, not decaying, but rewinding, shrinking, their forms flickering and then vanishing from existence. Aizawa was on the ground, his eyes bloody, unable to use his quirk. An accident, the broker explained placidly. A moment of intense fear that caused her to lose control. You could prevent it. You could will her power to be dormant, to be safe. You could save her from her own curse. For her own good. The final vision was the most terrible. He stood over a body. The spiky blonde hair, the scorched gauntlets, the costume he knew as well as his own. It was Bakugo. His chest was pierced by a metal rod, his eyes open and lifeless, staring up at a smoky sky. And kneeling beside him was Izuku himself, his hands covered in his friend's blood, screaming a silent, ragged scream of utter failure. He pushes himself too far to protect you, the broker's voice said, devoid of any sympathy. A heroic, predictable, and ultimately pointless death. A death you could prevent. You could will the attack to miss by an inch. You could will his body to be more durable. You could save him. The visions faded, and they were back in the gray mindscape, the collapsing hospital a silent testament to his past failure. Izuku was on his knees now, sobbing openly. The images had been more than pictures. He had felt the despair of each one, the crushing weight of those future failures. He saw a clear, unbroken line from the choice he faced today to the mountains of bodies in his future. He was weak. His power was weak. His philosophy was weak. And it was going to get everyone he loved killed. The broker stood over him, a silent, patient silhouette. It didn't need to say anything more. The argument had been made. His choice was clear: remain Izuku Midoriya and watch the world burn, or become a hollow savior and save it. Why? Izuku gasped, looking up at the perfect copy of his own face, his vision blurred by tears. Why are you doing this? For the first time, a genuine emotion flickered in the broker's eyes. It wasn't malice or greed. It was something that looked like cosmic curiosity. Because I am old, Izuku. I was here when your species huddled in caves, and I will be here when your sun burns out. Your quirks, they are the most fascinating, chaotic variable to be introduced into this reality in millennia. And you, with your singular, all-consuming desire to save everyone, you are the ultimate expression of that chaos. I want to see what a story looks like when the main character can truly control the narrative. It's an interesting experiment. An experiment. His soul, his love, his entire being, was just an experiment for an ancient, bored entity. The thought was so cold, so alien, that it extinguished the last ember of his resistance. He thought of the children on the bus. He thought of Hana in the hospital. He thought of Bakugo, cold and dead on the battlefield. He thought of All Might's sad, accepting words, "You can't save everyone." No, Izuku whispered to himself. That's unacceptable. He looked up at the broker, his face a mess of tears and resolve. He saw his own reflection in the entity's calm, green eyes. He was making a deal with himself, with the perfect, powerful hero he always wanted to be, and sacrificing the weak, crying boy he was. I accept, he said, the words feeling like stones in his throat. The broker nodded, a flicker of satisfaction in its gaze. The contract is made. As he spoke, a single, hot tear finally escaped Izuku's eye. It traced a path through the grime on his cheek, but it did not fall. It hung suspended in the air before him, shimmering in the shadowless light. It began to change, the clear liquid turning cloudy, then dark. It solidified, crystallizing into a perfect, multifaceted teardrop of pure black obsidian. Then, with a faint, tinkling sound that was deafening in the silence, it shattered into a fine, black dust. The dust didn't scatter. It surged forward, drawn to him, and sank into the skin of his chest, directly over his heart. It didn't burn. It was a spreading cold, a patch of absolute zero that seemed to extinguish the frantic warmth inside him. And then, deep within his core, one for all screamed. It was not a sound, but a feeling, a psychic supernova of pure agony and rejection. The connection he had always felt to the vestiges, the warm, reassuring presence of his predecessors, became a firestorm of denial. The world around him dissolved, and he was floating in the star-filled nexus of his quirk. But something was wrong. The stars were flickering, dying. The spectral forms of the previous users appeared around him, not as wise counsel, but as horrified phantoms. The second and third users were recoiling, their forms dissolving into static. Yoichi Shigaraki, the first, looked at him with an expression of profound, familial betrayal. But it was Nana Shimura who was the most vivid. Her ghostly form flickered violently. Her hand was outstretched towards him, her mouth open in a desperate, soundless warning. Her eyes were wide with a terror that transcended death itself. They were not trying to help him, they were trying to escape him. They were rejecting him as their successor, trying to sever a connection that had suddenly become poison. A new presence, cold and immense, entered the nexus. The broker's power. It was not a roaring fire like One for All. It was the void between the stars, the absolute silence of a dead world. It did not coexist with his quirk, it began to override it, the cold blackness consuming the warm, starlit energy. The vestiges screamed their silent screams and faded, their light extinguished. One for All wasn't gone, but it was suppressed. Caged. A dying ember trapped in a block of ice. The coldness from his chest spread through every vein, every nerve ending. He felt it rewriting him, not just his power, but his very perception. The frantic, chaotic energy of the world, the background noise of cause and effect, suddenly resolved itself. He could feel it now, the billions of tiny, frayed threads of reality, the infinite possibilities of every single moment. He felt the structure of the story, and he felt the pen in his hand. The mindscape vanished. He was back in the park, on his knees, the rain pouring down on him. But it was different. He could feel the trajectory of every single raindrop. He could feel the stress on every blade of grass beneath his knees. He could feel the grief of the rescue workers 3 blocks away as a tangible, measurable force. He stood up, his movements fluid and precise. The pain was gone. The exhaustion was gone. The frantic, heart-wrenching sorrow that had broken him was muted. It was a fact. A data point. Event: hospital wing collapse. Casualties high. Emotional response: significant grief, now archived. He looked at his hands, no longer shaking. They didn't feel like his own. They felt like tools, instruments of unimaginable potential. The contract was sealed. The price had begun to be paid. He was no longer just Izuku Midoriya, the crying boy who wanted to be a hero. He was something new. He was the author of the salvation to come. And his first edit would be to ensure that no tear, his or anyone else's, would ever be shed in such a way again. The cost was irrelevant. The outcome was all that mattered. A week passed in a state of muted gray. The world, which had always been a vibrant, chaotic storm of sensations for Izuku, had flattened. The roaring fire of his anxiety, the blinding sun of his admiration for All Might, the warm, fluttering wings of his affection for his friends, all had been banked, reduced to the gentle, heatless glow of embers seen from a great distance. He was living behind a pane of thick, soundproof glass. He attended his classes at Yurei with a new, unnerving focus. His old habit of frantic, inspired muttering had vanished, replaced by a silent, predatory stillness. His notebooks, once a chaotic explosion of hero analysis, emotional reactions, and shaky sketches, were now filled with crisp, clinical script. He no longer drew All Might's heroic smile. He diagrammed force vectors and calculated the tensile strength of Kamui Wood's lacquer. He wasn't a fanboy anymore. He was a systems analyst. His friends noticed. How could they not? Ida, ever the pragmatist, was the first to comment, though he framed it as a compliment. Midoriya-kun, he had declared, chopping the air with his hand after a particularly grueling training session. Your performance has achieved a new level of efficiency. Your reaction time has decreased by 12%, and your tactical assessments are flawless. You seem far more focused. Izuku had simply nodded, his eyes not on Ida, but on the training ground's damage report scrolling on a nearby monitor. Unnecessary emotional responses are a tactical liability, Ida-kun. I have merely eliminated them. The statement was so cold, so unlike him, that Ida's hand froze mid-chop. A flicker of concern crossed his face before he straightened his glasses and marched off, choosing to interpret the comment as a sign of newfound maturity. Uraraka was not so easily convinced. The vibrant warmth that had always flowed from him, the nervous, comforting energy that made him Deku, was gone. In its place was a polite, impenetrable wall. She tried to engage him in the common room, showing him a funny cat video on her phone, an old tactic guaranteed to make him blush and stammer. He'd watched it, his expression unchanging, and then offered a quiet analysis. The animal's behavior is a standard feline response to an unexpected auditory stimulus. Mildly amusing. He had then turned and walked away, leaving her staring at her phone, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. It felt like she had just shown a treasured home video to a stranger. Inside, Izuku was aware of their concern, but only as an abstract data point. The broker's power hummed within him, a constant, silent thrum of absolute cold that had caged the frantic, fiery energy of One for All. He could still feel his quirk, a distant, desperate warmth, like a caged bird beating its wings against the bars of a frozen prison. The vestiges were silent, their horrified screams from the night of the contract having faded into an oppressive absence. He was alone with his new editor, the voice of the broker now a permanent, dispassionate whisper in the back of his mind, offering suggestions for narrative clarity and thematic consistency. He was observing, learning the language of his new power, feeling the threads of causality that wove through the world around him. He could see them now, faint, shimmering lines of potential connecting every object, every person, every action. He saw the weak thread of a loose bolt on a window washing rig, the fraying thread of a driver's attention as he texted, the tangled, snarled threads of an impending argument between two students in the hall. It was like seeing the source code of reality, and the urge to reach out, to debug, to edit and perfect, was a constant, tantalizing pull. He was waiting for his moment. A true test. It came on a Tuesday. The alarm that blared through the UA campus was not a drill. It was a city-wide emergency broadcast, the kind reserved for disasters of the highest magnitude. A villain, calling himself Quakestep, was on a rampage through the city's central district. His quirk allowed him to convert the kinetic energy of his movement into powerful, localized seismic vibrations. Every step he took was a miniature earthquake. He wasn't just fighting, he was unmaking the city as he fled. By the time the members of Class 1A, given emergency clearance to assist, arrived at the scene, the situation was already critical. Quakestep, a hulking man encased in a cracked, piston-driven exoskeleton, was driving a stolen armored truck across the Anamino Bridge, the main artery connecting the east and west wards. With every few hundred feet the truck traveled, he would stomp his foot on the floorboard, and a shockwave would ripple through the vehicle, into the asphalt, and down into the support structure of the bridge itself. The Anamino Bridge was a marvel of modern engineering, but it was not designed to withstand a continuous, rhythmic assault from within. It was screaming. The sound of groaning steel and snapping suspension cables was a terrifying chorus that rose above the panicked screams of the thousands of civilians trapped in the rush-hour gridlock. The pro-heroes were already there, but their efforts were being tragically counterproductive. Empty Lady, in her giant form, tried to brace a support pylon from the river below, but her immense weight only put more strain on the already compromised foundations. Kamui would shot his lacquered chain prison towards the truck, but the wooden tendrils splintered into dust against the seismic vibrations before they could even make contact. Bakugo was a blur of orange and black, propelling himself through the air with controlled explosions. "Get out of the damn way!" he roared, firing an AP shot at the truck's tires. The blast connected, shredding the rubber, but the armored vehicle, running on its rims, barely slowed. Worse, the concussive force of the explosion traveled through the bridge deck, causing a fresh series of cracks to spiderweb across the surface. Bakugo, stop! Endeavor's voice boomed over the comms, his own flames held in check. Any further impact could trigger a total structural collapse. They were trapped in the same paradigm that had broken Izuku a week ago. Any action they took to stop the villain directly threatened to bring the entire bridge down, killing thousands. Inaction meant the villain would reach the other side and continue his rampage, leaving the fatally wounded bridge to collapse anyway. It was another impossible choice. Izuku watched the scene unfold not from the ground, but from the rooftop of a nearby skyscraper. He hadn't rushed in. He had taken his time, finding the optimal vantage point, his mind a silent, whirring supercomputer processing every variable. He saw the chaos, but he didn't feel the panic. He saw the shimmering threads of reality, and they were a tangled, screaming mess. He could see the main support cables, their causal threads glowing a bright, angry red, indicating imminent failure. He saw the probability of collapse climbing with every second, 87.6%, 89.2%, 91.4%. The broker's voice whispered in his mind, cool and instructive. The narrative is unbalanced. The antagonist's actions are creating an unacceptable plot hole, the destruction of a key setting and thousands of extras. An edit is required. Izuku took a calm breath. He didn't activate one for all. He didn't feel the familiar surge of green lightning. Instead, he reached out with his consciousness, his focus narrowing until the entire world, the screaming people, the frantic heroes, the rumbling truck, faded into a muted background. All he saw were the threads. His target was the bridge. He found the central, unifying thread of its existence, the core concept that defined it as the Anamino Bridge. It was a thick, complex tapestry woven from a million smaller threads, every rivet, every girder, every inch of asphalt. He saw the damage, the red threads of failure, as a virus spreading through the code. He did not try to hold it up. He did not try to reinforce it. He simply rewrote its condition. His will, cold and absolute, descended upon the structure. The command was simple, irrefutable: you are stable. Your structural integrity is perfect and absolute. Down below, the effect was instantaneous and utterly baffling. The terrifying, high-frequency groan of tortured metal did not just stop, it seemed to reverse. A suspension cable that had snapped clean in two, its ends whipping wildly, suddenly went slack, then pulled taut as the severed steel flowed back together, leaving not even a seam. The cracked spiderwebbing across the road surface vanished, the asphalt becoming a smooth, unbroken ribbon of black. The pylon-empty lady was struggling to support solidified, pushing back against her with a force that made her grunt in surprise. A profound, unnatural stillness fell over the entire structure. It was no longer a bridge on the verge of collapse. It was an axiom. A physical fact that could not be contested. Quake Step, inside the truck, felt the change immediately. He stomped again, harder this time, sending a vibration so powerful it should have turned the concrete beneath him to dust. The shockwave hit the bridge deck and simply vanished. It was like punching water. The bridge did not shake. It did not vibrate. It did not even tremble. It was utterly, supernaturally inert. What? The villain grunted, his confidence faltering for the first time. The heroes stared, mouths agape. Bakugo, hovering in the air, lowered his gauntlets. The hell. On the rooftop, Izuku felt the first wave of the transaction. It was a subtle, cold leeching at the back of his mind. He didn't know what it was taking yet. The miracle wasn't complete. He ignored it and shifted his focus. Target, the villain's vehicle. He saw the threads of its momentum, a bright arrow of forward velocity. He saw the internal combustion of the engine, the rotation of the axles, the friction of the metal rims against the pavement. It was another messy paragraph in a poorly written story. His will descended again. His command was even simpler. You are stopped. It was not a gradual deceleration. It was a violation of inertia. On the bridge, the armored truck, moving at over 60 miles per hour, came to a complete and instantaneous halt. There was no screech of tires, no lurching forward of its mass. One frame it was a speeding projectile, the next, it was a stationary statue. The kinetic energy that should have torn the vehicle apart, liquefying the villain inside, was not absorbed or redirected. It was simply unwritten. Deleted from the equation. The silence that followed was more shocking than any explosion. For a full 10 seconds, the entire city seemed to hold its breath. Thousands of people on the bridge, who had been bracing for death, slowly looked up from their cars. The heroes stared at the perfectly still truck, then at the impossibly pristine bridge, their minds struggling to reconcile what they had just witnessed. Then, from the rooftop, a flicker of green. Izuku used a minuscule, precise burst of one for all, just enough for a single leap, and landed silently on the roof of the stopped truck. His landing made no sound. He was no longer wearing his familiar, tattered costume. He wore a newer version, sleek and dark, the rabbit-like ears of his cowl now shorter, more like tactical horns. His face was obscured by a dark green visor and a metal rebreather, hiding his expression completely. He looked less like a hopeful symbol and more like a special forces operator. He calmly knelt, peeled back a section of the truck's roof as if it were a sardine can, and looked down at the stunned villain. Quakestep stared up at him, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. "It's over," Izuku said. His voice, filtered through the rebreather, was flat, metallic, and devoid of any emotion. He didn't offer a chance for surrender. He didn't deliver a heroic one-liner. It was a simple statement of fact. The rescue was perfect. 0 casualties. 0 injuries. Minimal property damage. It was a flawless, impossible victory that had unfolded in less than 30 seconds. As the police and other heroes swarmed the scene, taking the catatonic villain into custody, the awe began to set in. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras broadcasting the miracle to the world. Who was this hero? Was it Deku? He looked like Deku, but his methods were alien. There had been no grand smash, no display of overwhelming power. Just a quiet, absolute resolution. Bakugo was the first of his classmates to reach him, landing on the bridge with a crackle of explosions. Deku! What the hell was that? What was that trick? He demanded, his usual rage tinged with genuine confusion. Izuku turned to face him, his visored gaze unreadable. "I neutralized the threat," he stated simply. "Neutralize the, don't give me that robot crap." Bakugo snarled, stalking closer. The bridge was falling apart, and then it just wasn't. And that truck. You can't just stop something like that. How did you do it? My methods were effective, Izuku replied, his tone unchanging. The outcome is all that matters. Before Bakugo could explode, the others arrived. Kirishima, Todoroki, Ida, and Uraraka. They were a mixture of awestruck and concerned. "Midoriya, that was incredible!" Kirishima exclaimed, his hand raised for a fist bump that never came. "So manly! You saved everyone without even throwing a punch." Todoroki was silent, his heterochromatic eyes narrowed, studying Izuku with an unnerving intensity. He sensed the fundamental wrongness of the situation. It was Uraraka who broke through the circle of boys, her face bright with relief and joy, her cheeks flushed. "Deku-kun! You did it! I was so worried, we all were, but that was amazing. I can't even understand how, but you were just, wow!" She ran the last few steps, her arms slightly outstretched, her body language radiating warmth and a desire for a shared, triumphant moment. And as she approached, the second, larger payment for the miracle was exacted. The broker's cold presence intensified in his mind. Payment due for services rendered. Item: 1 foundational emotional memory. A sensation like ice water being poured directly onto his brain washed over him. He saw a flash of memory, so vivid it momentarily overwrote the scene in front of him. A giant, menacing 0-point robot. The terror of the UA entrance exam. The sight of a brown-haired girl, trapped under rubble. His own desperate, reckless leap. The shattering power of his first true smash. And then, falling, tumbling through the air, his body broken, and her gentle hand on his cheek. Her smiling face, her cheeks pink from exertion. The sudden, wonderful feeling of weightlessness. The overwhelming, heart-stopping wave of gratitude and something more, something warm and fluttering and deeply confusing that had made his face burn. The first time he had ever truly felt seen, not as a quirkless failure, but as someone worth saving. The memory played out in an instant, and as it did, the broker consumed it. The vibrant colors of the memory desaturated, fading to a stark, grainy black and white. The sounds, the crash of the robot, her bright voice, the frantic pounding of his own heart, dissolved into a dead, clinical silence. The feelings, the raw terror, the desperate surge of heroic instinct, the dizzying, brilliant warmth of her saving him, they were siphoned away, leaving a hollow, empty space. The memory was no longer a memory. It was a file. Event: UA High School Entrance Exam. Subject: Achiko Uraraka. Action: utilized her quirk, zero gravity, to prevent my fatal impact after I neutralized the 0-point obstacle. Outcome: successful. Survival ensured. Personal response: gratitude archived. The process took less than a second. He looked at the girl running towards him, her face alight with a joy he could no longer comprehend the source of. He saw Achiko Uraraka. A classmate, a valuable hero in training with a versatile gravity-based quirk. A useful ally. The warm, vibrant connection he'd once felt, the nervous crush that had colored so many of their interactions, was gone. The space it left behind wasn't sad. It wasn't anything. It was just empty. She stopped a few feet from him, her smile faltering slightly at his blank, silent stare. Deku-kun? He processed her words. She was congratulating him. A positive social interaction was expected in return. Thank you, Uraraka, he said, his voice a perfect, level monotone through the modulator. Your concern for my well-being is noted and appreciated. The words were technically correct, but they were so utterly devoid of warmth, so clinical, that they hung in the air like icicles. Uraraka's smile completely vanished, replaced by a look of profound confusion and hurt. It was as if she had run to hug a dear friend and had instead collided with a statue of cold marble. She took an involuntary step back. The others fell silent, sensing the sudden, glacial chill that had descended. Bakugo's angry shouting died in his throat. Even Kirishima's cheerful grin faded. They were all looking at him, at the stranger standing in their friend's suit. Izuku stood amidst the wreckage he had flawlessly saved, surrounded by the friends whose emotional connection he was beginning to sacrifice. The public would call him a hero, a savior, a miracle worker. But here, on this bridge, under the watchful eyes of those who knew him best, a new, terrifying truth was dawning. He had become more effective. But he was already a little less Izuku. And he felt the loss of it no more than a computer feels the deletion of a temporary file. He turned his visored gaze towards the city. There were more flaws in the system. More bugs to fix. More edits to be made. His work was just beginning. The title bestowed upon the event by the media was The Miracle on the Anamino Bridge. News channels played the helicopter footage on a continuous loop, the impossibly stable bridge, the armored truck frozen in place, and the dark green, almost black, figure of Deku descending like a specter to end the conflict without a single blow. He was the hero of the hour. Pundits debated the nature of his new power, speculating it was a secondary aspect of One for All, a quirk evolution of unprecedented scale. He was lauded for his efficiency, his control, his perfect, bloodless victory. To the world, Izuku Midoriya had ascended. To Class 1A, he had vanished. The boy who returned to the dorms that evening was a phantom wearing their friend's face. He walked with a new, unnerving economy of motion, his footsteps silent on the common room floor. The constant, restless energy that had always radiated from him was gone, replaced by a stillness so profound it felt like the air grew colder when he entered a room. He responded to the clamor of questions and congratulations from his less observant classmates with polite, monosyllabic answers, his eyes, once so expressive, now holding the flat, reflective quality of polished glass. They saw him, but he did not seem to see them. He was an observer, a data collector, and the vibrant, messy, emotional world of the Heights Alliance dorms was simply another data stream to be passively analyzed. The official debriefing was scheduled for the following afternoon. It was not to be a celebratory affair. The summons from Aizawa had been curt and formal. All members of Class 1A involved in the Anamino incident were to report to Briefing Room Gamma. Attendance was mandatory. The room was as sterile and cold as Izuku's new demeanor. A large, black conference table dominated the space, surrounded by severe-looking chairs. Aizawa stood at the head of the table, his arms crossed, his usual tired expression hardened with an edge of deep-seated concern. On the large holographic screen behind him, 3 figures were projected: the grim, flame-wreathed visage of Endeavor, the deceptively relaxed form of Hawks, and a third, smaller screen showing the skeletal, shadowed face of Tashinori Yagi. All Might's presence was a clear indicator that this was more than a standard mission review. Bakugo, Kirishima, Ida, Todoroki, and Uraraka filed in, the tension in the room palpable. They took their seats, a nervous energy rippling between them. Izuku entered last, moving with the same silent grace he'd shown on the bridge. He took the empty seat at the far end of the table, directly opposite Aizawa, and sat perfectly still, his back straight, his hands resting calmly on the table before him. He looked less like a student and more like a delegate at a high-stakes political summit. Aizawa let the silence hang for a moment, his dark eyes sweeping over each student before finally landing, and staying, on Izuku. "Let's begin," he said, his voice a low gravel. "The official reports on the Quake Step incident are contradictory. The outcome was optimal: 0 casualties, minimal infrastructure damage beyond the villain's initial rampage. A textbook success by every metric the Hero Public Safety Commission uses." He paused, letting the implication sink in. "However, the methodology is unaccounted for. We are here to account for it. Bakugo, you were the first responder from UA report." Bakugo shifted in his seat, scowling. The bridge was coming apart. Thing was a damn death trap. I tried to disable the vehicle, but any concussive force just made it worse. Every hero on scene was stuck. He shot a sideways glare at Izuku. Then he showed up. And the bridge just stopped breaking. And the truck just stopped moving. That's it. It was like someone flipped a switch. "A switch," Aizawa repeated, his gaze unwavering on Izuku. "Midoriya. Your turn. Provide a full, detailed account of your actions from the moment you arrived on scene." Izuku's posture didn't change. He didn't look nervous. He didn't even seem to be breathing heavily. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and stripped of all his old, familiar hesitations. "Affirmative, Aizawa-sensei," he began, the formal address sounding alien in its new, crisp delivery. "Upon arrival, I performed a threat assessment from a superior vantage point. My analysis concluded that conventional heroic intervention, as demonstrated by the pro-heroes and my classmates, was exacerbating the structural instability of the bridge. The probability of catastrophic collapse was 91.4% and climbing at a rate of 0.2% per second. The clinical precision of the numbers sent a chill down Uraraka's spine. The primary flaw in the existing strategy was a focus on kinetic force application, Izuku continued, his gaze sweeping the room, though it didn't seem to truly land on anyone. Bakugo's AP shot, while accurately aimed, introduced a high-frequency shockwave that propagated through the bridge deck, accelerating stress fractures. Empty Lady's attempt to brace the pylon was logically sound but failed to account for the villain's quirk transferring vibrations through the riverbed, thus weakening the very foundation she was trying to support. All active measures were fundamentally counterproductive. It wasn't a report. It was a critique. A cold, systematic dismantling of everyone else's efforts. Bakugo's hands clenched into fists under the table, his knuckles turning white. Kirishima shot him a worried look. "So you chose a different approach," Aizawa prompted, his voice dangerously level. "Correct," Izuku said with a slight nod. "I determined that the problem was not the villain, but the state of the bridge itself. The structure's condition had been compromised. Therefore, the most efficient solution was to directly address and rectify that condition." On the screen, Endeavor's fiery brows furrowed. "What does that mean, rectify the condition? Did you use a new application of your quirk? Some kind of vibration dampening?" Izuku's head tilted slightly, an almost bird-like motion of curiosity. "One for All is a tool for overwhelming kinetic energy release. Applying it in that context would have been illogical, equivalent to using a sledgehammer for neurosurgery. My solution was more direct. I focused my intent on the bridge and asserted a new state of being upon it, structural stability. The physical manifestation of this assertion was the immediate cessation of all structural degradation. The room fell silent. The sheer audacity and incomprehensibility of the statement left them speechless. He spoke of altering reality as casually as one might speak of changing a flat tire. You asserted a new state of being? Hawks repeated from the screen, a lazy smile frozen on his face, though his golden eyes were sharp as a raptor's. That sounds a lot like a reality-warping quirk, Midoriya, and last I checked, that wasn't on your file. It is an extension of my will, Izuku replied, his voice uninflected. The specifics are difficult to quantify in conventional quirk terminology. Try, Aizawa commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. The universe operates on a system of cause and effect, governed by established physical laws, Izuku explained, sounding like a physics professor delivering a lecture. My ability allows me to introduce a new, overriding axiom into a localized system. In this case, the axiom was the Anamino bridge is stable. All physical laws within the system then recalibrated to accommodate this new, incontrovertible fact. The steel ceased to break because the axiom dictated it could not. The concrete ceased to crack because its nature was now defined by stability. Tashinori's skeletal face was pale, his mouth slightly agape. He was watching his boy, his successor, speak a language of cold, cosmic power that had nothing to do with the heroic, human spirit of One for All. It was the language of a god. Or a monster. And the truck? Aizawa pressed, his eyes narrowing. A similar principle, Izuku said. The axiom introduced was the vehicle is stationary. The system's physics engine simply complied. The kinetic energy did not need to be absorbed or redirected. Its existence was rendered null by the new axiom. Bakugo couldn't take it anymore. He slammed his fist on the table, the sound a sharp crack in the tense silence. What kind of bullshit is that? He roared, jumping to his feet. You're talking like you're writing a damn video game. Physics engine? Axioms? Stop talking like a damn robot and tell us what you really did, Deku. Izuku turned his head to look at Bakugo. There was no fear in his eyes. No anger. No reaction at all. It was like being stared at by a security camera. My explanation was precise and factual, Bakugo, he replied, his voice still perfectly level. Your inability to comprehend it stems from an emotional, rather than a logical, response. You are frustrated because my methods have superseded your own in terms of effectiveness. Your reliance on brute force and aggression is a significant tactical flaw. The insult was so direct, so clinically delivered, that it took the air out of Bakugo's rage, leaving him momentarily stunned. That's enough. Kirishima interjected, standing up to put a hand on Bakugo's shoulder. That's not cool, Midoriya. We're a team. You can't just talk to him like that. He is correct, Todoroki said quietly, his voice drawing everyone's attention. He was looking at Izuku, his expression a mask of intense concentration. Bakugo's frustration is emotional. But that's not the point. He turned his gaze to Izuku. The point is that what you're describing, Midoriya, isn't heroism. It's control. Absolute control. You didn't save the bridge. You commanded it. You didn't stop the villain. You deleted his momentum. Where does it end? The question hung in the air, chilling and profound. Izuku considered it for a moment, his head tilting again. It ends when the probability of unacceptable loss trends to zero. The goal of heroism is the preservation of life and order. My methods are the most logical path to achieving that goal with 100% efficiency. He looked directly at Bakugo, who was still trembling with a mixture of rage and confusion. My methods were 100% effective. The outcome is all that matters. That was the final blow. The statement was a complete repudiation of everything they had ever learned. Everything they believed in. The struggle, the effort, the heart, the teamwork, none of it mattered in the face of his cold, perfect results. Debriefing over, Aizawa said abruptly, his voice tight. Everyone out. Midoriya, you stay. The students filed out, a cloud of bewilderment and hurt feelings following them. All Might's screen went dark without a word. As Uraraka passed Izuku, she looked at him, her eyes pleading, trying to find a flicker of the boy she knew. She found nothing. She hurried out of the room, her shoulders slumped. The common room of the Heights Alliance dorm was usually a hub of noise and activity. That evening, it was as quiet as a library during finals. The members of the Deku squad, as they had been informally dubbed, sat clustered on one of the couches, a small island in a sea of tense silence. The rest of the class gave them a wide berth, unsure how to approach the strange, uncomfortable schism that had just opened in their midst. Ida, Uraraka, and Todoroki sat in a tight, worried knot. Tsuyu and Shiso, who often gravitated to their group, were nearby, looking equally concerned. They were waiting. Aizawa had kept Izuku for another hour, and the sound of the front door opening made them all jump. Izuku walked in, his expression as placid as ever. He seemed completely unaffected by the debriefing or his private meeting with their teacher. He made a straight line for the kitchen, presumably to get a glass of water. Ada stood up, adjusting his glasses, assuming his role as class representative and concerned friend. Midoriya-kun, he began, his voice formal but laced with genuine worry. We were concerned. Is everything all right with Aizawa-sensei? Izuku paused, turning to face them. Aizawa-sensei expressed concerns regarding the unknown parameters of my evolved abilities. I have agreed to undergo a full analysis with him and Hound Dog to ensure my psychological state aligns with UA's operational standards. It is a logical precaution. He spoke of his own mental evaluation as if it were a routine vehicle inspection. Uraraka couldn't stay silent any longer. She stood up, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Deku-kun, why are you being like this? She asked, her voice small and trembling. You were so cold in there. The way you talked to Kaken, to all of us. It wasn't like you. Izuku processed her question. His internal editor provided a helpful annotation. Subject is experiencing emotional distress due to behavioral incongruity. Reassurance is required to restore equilibrium. I understand my recent shift in demeanor may be jarring, he said, his tone softening into a carefully modulated, almost synthetic approximation of reassurance. But you must understand, Uraraka-san, the incident with Kismet revealed a fundamental flaw in my previous operational paradigm. My emotional responses were a liability. They led to hesitation and a suboptimal outcome. I have simply optimized myself. I am more focused now. This is a good thing. It will allow me to be a better hero. His explanation, meant to be comforting, was the most terrifying thing he could have said. He wasn't lashing out in anger or grief. He truly, logically believed that stripping away his own humanity was an upgrade. A better hero? Ida pressed, taking a step forward. But heroism is not just about outcomes, Midoriya-kun. It is about spirit. About inspiring people. About the bonds of trust we form as a team. You disregarded all of that today. Teamwork is a method of compensating for individual weaknesses, Izuku countered, his voice losing its fabricated softness. An ideal hero would have no weaknesses to compensate for. The concept of spirit is an unquantifiable, sentimental variable that has no place in high-stakes threat neutralization. And inspiration is a secondary, often inefficient, byproduct of a successful rescue, not its primary goal. Each sentence was a perfectly logical, perfectly soulless brick being laid in the wall he was building between himself and them. He was taking the core tenets of their shared dream and dissecting them on a cold, metal slab, declaring them obsolete. It was Todoroki who finally cut to the heart of it. He had been silent the whole time, his gaze fixed on Izuku's face, not his posture or his words, but his eyes. He stood up and walked slowly towards Izuku, stopping a few feet away. The common room was so quiet they could hear the hum of the refrigerator. I know what it's like to suppress a part of yourself, Todoroki said, his voice a low, even murmur. To try and operate on logic alone. My father tried to turn me into that. A perfect tool, unburdened by emotion. He looked directly into Izuku's eyes. But even when I was at my coldest, when I hated everything, I could still feel it. The anger. The resentment. It was still there. When I look at you now. Todoroki leaned in slightly, his expression one of profound, chilling discovery. Your eyes are the same color, Midoriya. But the person looking through them feels different. It's not that you're suppressing your emotions. It's like they're not there at all. It feels empty. The diagnosis was so accurate, so piercing, that it should have elicited a reaction. A denial. A flicker of fear. But Izuku's expression remained unchanged. He registered Todoroki's words as another data point. Observation: Todoroki Shoto perceives an absence of emotional response. Conclusion: my optimization is externally detectable. A quiet, insidious whisper echoed in the back of his mind, the smooth, calm voice of the broker. They are inefficient, Izuku. Their sentimentality is a chain. They will hold you back from your true potential. They are obstacles on the path to a perfect world. Izuku blinked slowly. I assure you, I am fine, he said to Todoroki, his voice the epitome of calm. I am simply more focused. You will all see the benefits of my new approach in time. He then turned, retrieved his glass of water from the kitchen, and walked towards the elevators, leaving his 3 closest friends standing in the middle of the room, staring at his back. The chasm between them had widened into a canyon. They had tried to reach across, to pull their friend back from the ledge. But they had found that he wasn't on the ledge at all. He had already willingly jumped, believing he would fly. As the elevator doors slid shut, separating him from their worried faces, Izuku took a sip of water. He felt nothing, not the satisfaction of winning an argument, not the sting of his friend's concern, not the loneliness of his new isolation. He felt only a placid, quiet sense of purpose. Todoroki was right. The person they knew was gone. Izuku Midoriya, the crying Fanba, was a discarded draft. The author was now in control, and the story of a perfect, logical hero was just beginning. The week following the miracle on the Anamino Bridge settled into a new, disquieting rhythm at UA High. Izuku Midoriya was no longer a person, he was a presence. A silent, observant fixture in the common room, a hyper-efficient variable in training exercises, a dispassionate voice of pure logic in classroom discussions. He was a ghost haunting the shell of their friend. His friends had not given up, but their efforts were becoming exercises in futility. They were trying to resuscitate a heart that had willingly stopped beating. Uraraka approached him one evening while he was reviewing tactical schematics on a datapad, his focus absolute. Deku-kun, she began, her voice soft, tentative. I was having some trouble with the vector analysis for our next ectoplasm drill. I remember you had some great ideas last time. He didn't look up from his screen. The optimal solution is a ricochet strategy utilizing a 73-degree angle off the primary wall to bypass the clone's initial defensive posture. Your quirk is best applied not as a direct offensive tool, but as an environmental control measure to alter the clone's center of gravity a split second before impact. The math is straightforward. He said nothing more. He didn't offer to help, didn't ask her to sit, didn't show any of the old, stumbling eagerness to work together. He had given her the answer, the most efficient solution, and in his mind, the interaction was complete. Uraraka stood there for a long moment, the warmth of her request dissipating against the wall of his cold logic, before she quietly walked away. The chasm was no longer just emotional, it was functional. He no longer saw them as friends, but as colleagues with specific, quantifiable skill sets. Aizawa, true to his word, had placed Izuku under strict observation. He was benched from all official team missions, a decision Izuku accepted with a nod, stating it was a prudent, if ultimately unnecessary, precaution. However, he was still a hero in training, and total confinement was counterproductive. A compromise was reached. Izuku was permitted to conduct solo patrols in designated, low-risk sectors of the city. He was to observe, report, and only intervene in minor incidents. It was a leash, a way for the UA faculty to monitor his behavior in a controlled field environment. They didn't know that for Izuku, it was an opportunity. A laboratory. And they didn't know that his oldest mentor, racked with a grief that felt deeper than the loss of his own power, had decided to become his silent, unseen shadow. The Hosu Ward night air was thick with the ghosts of old sins. It smelled of damp alleyways, cheap noodle stalls, and the faint, metallic tang of desperation that clung to the city's underbelly. This was where the hero-killer, Stain, had made his bloody stand, a place forever marked by a violent, ideological crusade. To the old Izuku, a patrol here would have been a tense, hyper-aware experience, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and heroic determination. He would have felt the weight of Stain's legacy, the suffering of the people in the shadows, the moral complexities of a society that produces such darkness. The new Izuku felt none of that. As he moved silently across the rooftops, his dark green costume blending with the night, his senses were extended in a way that had nothing to do with emotion. He was a living sensor suite. He processed the city not as a community of souls, but as a complex system of variables. He registered the decibel level of a distant argument, the heat signature of a homeless man sleeping under a bridge, the probability of a traffic light malfunction at a deserted intersection 2 blocks away. He was not feeling the city's pulse. He was reading its diagnostic report. The broker's voice was a quiet hum in the background of his thoughts, a co-pilot on his journey into a new kind of heroism. The system is inefficient. Look at the variables: poverty, addiction, untreated mental illness. These are the root causes of 87% of all petty crime. The hero's current model of punching the symptom is a fundamentally flawed design, Izuku agreed. The current model was reactive. It waited for the code to break, for the system to crash, and then sent in glorified tech support to deal with the error message. It was illogical. The only rational approach was to debug the system itself. Proactively, his attention was drawn to a flicker of movement in a derelict alleyway below. 3 men, huddled under the weak, buzzing glow of a single sodium lamp. He dropped into a crouch at the edge of the rooftop, his presence utterly undetectable. He zoomed in with the optical sensors in his visor, augmenting the feed with a passive scan of their biometrics. Heart rates elevated. Adrenaline levels rising. He activated his suit's audio enhancers and listened. The shipment comes in at 0200, the largest of the 3. A man with cheap cybernetic knuckles that whirred softly, was saying. His name, according to a quick cross-reference of a low-level offender database, was Kenji Clank Tanaka. It's medical supplies. High-grade painkillers, biofoam, the good stuff. The warehouse has 2 guards, old guys. We go in fast, we go in quiet. You sure about this, Clank? Asked the second man, a wiry figure named Sato Razor Endo, who kept nervously flicking open a cheap gravity knife. Hitting a med supply depot, it feels different. Different how? Sneered the third, a woman with a shock of pink hair and a manic energy about her that earned her the street name Jinx. It pays the bills, don't it? My kid needs medicine I can't afford, and these corporate bastards are sitting on a mountain of it. It's justice, in a way. Izuku processed the information. Threat level minor, motivation, financial desperation, compounded by familial medical needs. Plan, armed robbery of a medical supply warehouse. Probable outcomes of conventional intervention. 1. Direct confrontation, high probability of success. Moderate probability of non-lethal injuries to the perpetrators. Low probability of injury to self. High probability of their incarceration. High probability of their reoffending upon release due to unresolved root causes. 2. Report and observe. Allow local police to intervene. Similar outcome to option 1, with increased risk to law enforcement personnel. Both options were suboptimal. They addressed the immediate crime but did nothing to solve the underlying problem. They were temporary patches on a systemic flaw. There was a third option. A more efficient, more compassionate, and far more terrifying one. The narrative of their lives is leading to a destructive, repetitive loop, the broker whispered, its voice like the gentle rustle of a turning page. A small edit can provide them with a new plot direction. Izuku dropped silently into the alley, landing on the damp pavement without a sound. He didn't land in a heroic crouch or a dramatic pose. He simply appeared, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows. The 3 would-be robbers froze, their conversation dying in their throats. They spun around, their faces a mixture of shock and fear. Who the hell dash? Clank started, raising his whirring cybernetic fists. It's a hero! Razor hissed, brandishing his knife. Probably just a rookie on patrol. Jinx just stared, her manic energy curdling into genuine terror. It's him, she whispered. The one from the bridge. Izuku stood perfectly still, his visored face a blank, unreadable slate. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply focused. He reached out with his will, with the author's pen, and looked at the shimmering threads of their beings. He saw the tangled, frayed code of their motivations. Clank's was a knot of pride, resentment at being laid off, and a brutish desire to provide for his family through the only means he felt he had left. Razor's was a simpler thread of fear and follower's instinct. Jinx's was a bright, painful line of desperate love for her sick child, twisted into a justification for criminality. He saw the core desire that united them: we will commit this crime. It was an active line of code, a command driving their actions. A conventional hero would fight the actions. Izuku decided to edit the command. He didn't try to flood their minds with guilt or fear. He didn't attempt to brainwash them into model citizens. His touch was far more subtle, far more insidious. He simply selected the thread of their criminal intent, and snipped it. From the outside, nothing happened. But inside the minds of the three criminals, their entire world quietly tilted on its axis. Clank was the first to feel it. He was looking at the hero, his fists raised, ready for a fight that would prove he was still strong, still a man who could take what he needed. And then, the feeling just evaporated. The anger, the drive, the sense of purpose, it all deflated like a punctured lung. He looked down at his cybernetic hands, the knuckles whirring uselessly. They suddenly felt heavy, clumsy, and ridiculous. The thought of smashing them into someone's face, of breaking into a warehouse, it seemed so exhausting. So pointless. Why would he ever want to do that? He just wanted to go home and sleep. Razor felt a wave of profound social awkwardness wash over him. He was standing in a dark alley with a knife in his hand, facing a pro-hero. The situation was, when he really thought about it, absurd. He was a thief. Since when? He didn't like violence. He didn't like confrontation. The gravity knife in his hand suddenly felt alien, a dangerous prop from a movie he had no interest in watching. He felt a blush creep up his neck, a deep, mortifying embarrassment for his current life choices. Jinx's experience was the most profound. The fiery, righteous anger she felt towards the faceless corporations, the desperate love for her daughter that she had sharpened into a weapon, it all softened. The sharp edges dissolved, leaving behind only the core emotion, love. And a deep, weary sadness. Stealing wouldn't fix her daughter's illness. It was a temporary, dangerous fix for a permanent problem. The thought of the heist, the violence, the risk, it now felt like a betrayal of the very person she was trying to protect. What her daughter needed wasn't stolen medicine. She needed her mother. Safe. Present. Clank slowly lowered his fists, the whirring of his knuckles sputtering to a halt. He looked at Razor, then at Jinx, his face a mask of deep, existential confusion. What are we doing here? He mumbled. Razor quickly pocketed his knife, unable to meet anyone's gaze. I don't know, he whispered. This is stupid. This is really, really stupid. Jinx let out a soft, shaky breath. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She dropped the crowbar she was holding, and it clattered loudly on the pavement. I have to go home, she said, her voice thick with a sorrow and clarity she hadn't felt in years. I have to go home. Without another word, they turned and walked away. Not running. Not fleeing. They simply departed, their shoulders slumped, their heads down, as if waking from a long, troubling dream. They left their tools, their plans, and their criminal identities behind them in the dirt of the alley. Izuku watched them go, his posture unchanging. The operation was a success. 100% effective. No violence, no arrests, no lengthy judicial process. He had not just stopped a crime, he had unwritten 3 criminals. That was not heroism. The voice was quiet, raspy, and filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to absorb the light around it. Izuku turned. From the deeper shadows at the mouth of the alley, a skeletal figure emerged. Toshinori Yagi, in his civilian form, his oversized clothes hanging loosely on his emaciated frame. He looked older than he had just a week ago, his eyes sunken, his face a portrait of profound disillusionment. All Might, Izuku said. The name was a simple identifier, devoid of the reverence it once held. What did you do to them, young Midoriya? Toshinori asked, his voice trembling slightly. That wasn't a fight. You didn't even talk them down. They just stopped. I provided them with a new perspective, Izuku stated, his voice calm and even through the modulator. I removed the flawed logic that led them to criminality. I gave them the opportunity to choose a more productive path. You gave them the opportunity? Tashinori took a shuffling step forward, his gaunt frame radiating a furious, heartbroken energy. Choice is not something you give, my boy. It's something a person has. You didn't give them a choice. You took their first one away. The choice to do wrong, the choice to struggle, the choice to find redemption on their own terms. A hero's job is to stop the crime, not to rewrite the sinner. His voice rose, cracking with emotion. Do you think every villain I fought was pure evil? Many were just like them. Lost, desperate, broken. But I fought them, I stopped them, and I handed them over to a system that, for all its flaws, allows for the possibility of change. I gave them that chance. What you just did, that was a violation. You reached into their minds and took something that wasn't yours to take. Izuku listened to the speech, processing it as he would any other data stream. He identified the core arguments: the sanctity of free will, the importance of struggle, the potential for redemption. He cross-referenced these concepts with his primary objective: the preservation of life and order with maximum efficiency. He found them incompatible. The concepts you're describing are emotionally driven and tactically inefficient. All might, Izuku replied, his tone remaining perfectly level. It was the dispassionate voice of a student correcting an elderly, beloved professor on a long-disproven theory. Those three individuals had a 92% probability of being arrested within the next 6 months. There was a 47% probability of their actions leading to an armed confrontation resulting in injury. Upon release, their recidivism rate would be over 70%. I collapsed those probabilities to near zero. I saved their future victims, and I saved them from a life of incarceration and violence. It is the most logical, and the most compassionate, outcome. He took a step towards his former idol, his unreadable visor seeming to stare right through the frail man. Your model of heroism is based on conflict. It requires villains to exist, tragedies to occur. It is a reactive loop of violence and sentiment. You don't solve problems, you just manage the symptoms. My morality is proactive. It is preventative. It is, by every measurable metric, superior. And as he spoke the final, devastating words, rejecting the very foundation of the man who had given him his dream, the broker collected its fee. Your morality is inefficient, All Might. The transaction was instantaneous. A cold, surgical excision in the archives of his soul. He was a child again. Small, quirkless, worthless. The suffocating, gelatinous body of the sludge villain was pouring down his throat, into his lungs. He was dying. He was clawing, scratching, his vision tunneling to a single point of blackness. Then, a voice like a thunderclap. Texas smash, a hurricane of pure, righteous power. The villain was gone, blasted into 1,000 harmless droplets. The pressure vanished. He could breathe. Rain began to fall, not from the sky, but from the sheer force of the hero's arrival. And standing there, silhouetted against the light, was him. All Might. His savior. His God. Later, on the rooftop. The crushing despair. The dream turned to dust. The skinny, broken man telling him to be realistic. And then the turn. The words that were the cornerstone of his entire existence. The phrase that had built the hero Deku from the ashes of the boy Izuku. You can become a hero. The memory, so bright it had burned like a sun in his heart for years, began to flicker. The vibrant colors. The brilliant yellow of All Might's hair, the deep blue of the sky, the radiant sunlight that seemed to burst from the hero's smile, faded to a dull, washed-out gray. The sound, the roar of the smash, the gentle patter of the rain, the booming, hopeful cadence of his idol's voice, dissolved into a dead, flat silence. And the feeling, the overwhelming, soul-shattering wave of pure, unadulterated salvation. The awe. The gratitude that was so immense it felt like his heart would explode. The blinding, tearful hope of a drowning boy being pulled into the light. It was siphoned away. A vacuum cleaner turned on in the center of his soul, sucking out every last drop of that sacred emotion. The memory was no longer a memory. It was a file. Event, sludge villain incident. Subject, Tashinori Yagi, All Might. Action 1, rescued me from a C-rank villain. Action 2, despite initial rejection, later affirmed my heroic potential, offering me his quirk, one for all. Significance acted as the primary catalyst for my acquisition of a quirk and subsequent enrollment in UA High School. Emotional response, awe/gratitude, archived/consumed. The process was complete. Izuku looked at the frail, heartbroken man standing before him in the alley. He no longer saw the symbol of peace. He no longer saw his mentor, his father figure, the man who had saved him in every way a person could be saved. He saw Tashinori Yagi, the eighth wielder of One for All. A predecessor. A man of immense physical power but demonstrably flawed strategic and ethical doctrines. An outdated operating system. An obstacle. Your sentiment is a liability, Tashinori-san, Izuku said, the use of the man's civilian name a final, unintentional cruelty. It prevents you from seeing the optimal solution. Tashinori visibly flinched, the name striking him with the force of a physical blow. He stared at the boy in front of him, and for the first time, he understood. This wasn't a phase. This wasn't a trauma response. The boy he had chosen, the boy who had inherited his will, was gone. Erased. And in his place stood this cold, logical engine of salvation, an entity that looked at the human soul and saw only a problem to be solved. Without another word, Izuku turned and walked past him, melting back into the shadows of the city. He left Tashinori Yagi standing alone in the alley, a relic surrounded by the ghosts of a heroism his own successor had just declared obsolete.